talk about canvases just for a few minutes. I want to make sure that you've got the right type and that you buy a canvas that's going to last you a while. There is cotton duck canvas, which is probably the cheapest canvas that you can buy, or the least expensive. And then there's linen, which is quite expensive, and there's also silk. For oil or acrylic, you want cotton or linen. And there are some things you want to look for when you buy these canvases. There's rough and smooth surface. The smoother surface is more for a real tight still life, or something very photorealistic, or for portraiture. A rougher feeling canvas is more for landscape and seascapes. So when you feel the texture of it, if it feels like sandpaper, it's probably a landscape portrait or a canvas. And if it's smooth, it's probably for portrait. So the other thing you want to look for is on the back of your canvas. You're going to see, these are called stretcher bars. And it's what supports the linen or the cotton that you're using. What you want to look for is this center brace. And you also want to see that there's more canvas wrapped around the edges of the outer side of the stretcher bars, because if you ever have to re-stretch this, you have to have enough canvas to pull around the edges. Many canvases are stapled on the outside, and you probably want to avoid that if you can. You want to get them stapled on the back with plenty of overhang. Now if I took out the spline in this piece, there'd be plenty of canvas back here. This canvas is called a gallery wrap because the edges are wrapped all the way around. So essentially you don't have to frame this. If you paint the sides, you can hang it as is. You want to make sure that the grain of the fabric is perfectly vertical and horizontal. If the grain is at an angle, the painting will warp as soon as it starts to dry. And then you also want to make sure that it's not warped when you buy it. What I do is I lay it down on the floor at the store and just push down on one edge. If it rocks, it's probably warped. A good way to tell a good canvas from a bad canvas. Some of the canvases, they'll say on the front double or triple primed. That means that they've taken a product called gesso and they have painted the raw surface with the gesso, which is your support that you paint on. Even if it says double or triple primed, that doesn't mean it's primed well enough. So one little trick that I use when I go to the store, I take the canvas and I hold it up very close to a light source, and I look for pinholes of light that come through. If there are pinholes of light that you can see through the canvas, then you either need to get a better one or you need to buy gesso and prime it and give it another layer or two yourself. Gesso can be bought at any art store, and you put that on with a brush, just a light coat, follow the directions, and it's easy, and it takes about 8 hours to dry, or you can use a fan and it will dry faster. If you want a real smooth surface, then you've got to use real nice, smooth, horizontal or vertical strokes. If you want some texture from the gesso, cross-hatch with your brush, and that'll give you texture underneath your paint. Okay, now we need to take a few minutes to talk about the equipment that we're going to use and the paints and how they're set up. One of the biggest problems with beginning painters is that they paint on a white palette. You don't want to do that because the colors that you mix on white are going to be painted on a surface which is not white. So your eye needs to match the colors that you're painting here, or mixing here, to the colors that are going to be on the canvas itself. Now what I use is just a piece of glass. Safety glass is best, and the thicker the better, because after a while these things can break. And the way I set up my palette is that I start with my lightest values and then go on down toward my darkest values, with the whites, the creams, and the grays and blacks on top, browns and greens on the right-hand side. And the way they're set up is not just from light to dark, but also from warm to cool. This is the palette knife that I use. The long ones don't seem to work so well. This is a J11, and it's shaped like a spade. As far as the brushes go, you want to use what you're comfortable with and what you're used to using. This brush is called an angular shader for obvious reasons. It's cut at an angle, and it's great for spreading the paint a long ways, but it's also great for making rocks. And the rocks that we're going to be working with are granite, and so you've got nice sharp edges, so an angular shader works very well. We're also going to be using some brights, both bristle and synthetics of various sizes. These are not expensive. These are American Painter brushes, and they work just great. Now the other brush, I call a magic brush. This brush is wonderful. This is for very soft blending, and when we get into working with mist, you want a brush that has a very soft, long bristle to it. This is a synthetic. It's an 1.5" shader, square shader. You need a minimum of 3 value changes. That is the change from light to medium to dark. You need a minimum of 3, light, medium, and dark. You can have as many as you want, but you've got to have 3 in order to make something look 3-dimensional. So in our background, if you want a lot of depth, you need to have lighter values, less detail, and the colors need to be closer together. And then as you come forward into your painting, you want your colors to get brighter, more contrast, and sharper in detail. And then as you come to the very forefront of your painting, that's where you want your darkest or lightest or brightest colors and more of the detail in the front. That gives you maximum depth in your composition. All right, so what I'm trying to establish right now is my value structure. So I've got that, it's covered well enough for me to see where I'm going to have my lights and my darks and my middle values. I'm going to finish this area. I'm going to go to the next side. I want to make sure that this area, this section, is lighter in value than the area on the left-hand side. So we used black to establish this side. So we need a lighter value here. So we're going to take Payne's Gray, same brush. I don't even clean it off, actually. So I'm going to get some wonderful muddy colors in there. So I'm going to take Payne's Gray, which has been mixed very lightly with the gray of grays. It's going to give me just a little bit lighter value, and you'll be able to see that right away on the canvas. I'm using the same brush technique. Dots and dashes work as well, but the cross-hatching for any area that has a lot of texture like granite or any kind of rock formation, the cross-hatching works best for me. I'm going to pick a softer brush, and right now I'm going to just pick up the gray of grays, just a little bit on the tip of my brush here. Now starting at the bottom of the waterfall, I'm going to wiggle this brush up into the wet paint. And the trick with this is not to go over it a million times. Only work into it until your value structure is the value that you want. It's going to be lighter at the bottom than it is at the top, because that's where most of the sunlight is, and that's where most of the action is. I want to create a nice light edge, a lighter edge along this ridge, rocky ridge here. We've got cool, lighter on the right, and we've got cool, darker on the left. There are a few highlights up here where the sun has just peeked through over the edge here. And then we have some mixtures of burnt sienna and burnt umber mixed in with a little bit of our unbleached titanium, which gives us these sort of chocolatey colors. But in oil painting, we paint from dark to light. So right now I'm going to put in, first thing I'm going to do is put in my shadows underneath the rocks. So I'm going to use just a tiny bit of black and a little bit of burnt umber right from the tube. And I'm going to begin to outline where I want my shadows. You want to tie your shadows in. Connect them as often as you can. In other words, the shadows from this side, or not the shadows necessarily, but the darks, you want to tie them together. So they will actually, in ribbons of dark, be tied all together. It makes a much more powerful statement and a lot more drama in your painting. Now notice the angle of my brush strokes. I'm trying to mimic the sides and shapes of the rocks. You can start out with a plan. In fact, if you work from a photograph or if you work from life, you can start out with an exact likeness. But if you copy it exactly, it kind of loses a little bit, becomes a little bit boring. So don't be afraid to experiment with a shape. There's something interesting about working with photographs, by the way. Can't tell you how many times as a student I have critiqued a piece of artwork where a student has painted from a photograph, and I'll make a correction for them and make a suggestion, that is. And the comment I get back most often is, well, it looked just like that in the photograph, and often they'll just even show me the photograph. Well, there's a problem with that, in that there are very few perfect photographs. And when we as humans look at a photograph, we believe what we see because, after all, it is a photograph. And cameras don't lie. Well, I'm here to tell you they do lie, but that's not the bigger issue. The bigger issue is that you need to make your work, if you're working from photographs, you need to make your work better than a photograph. And we're going to believe everything that we see in a photograph, but if you paint that photo exactly, any flaw in that photographic composition is going to be heavily critiqued by your viewers when it becomes a painting or a drawing. There's a whole other set of rules that people use when they view artwork. And if your artwork is hanging in a museum or a gallery, and someone comes by and says, that doesn't look right, you're not going to be there to tell them, but it looks just like the photograph. Okay, so on this side I've established